obstetric emergencies. We've got quite a very experienced panel. We've got Sue Jevons, who is joining us from a sort of coronial quality team perspective. We've got Ian Massell, who most of you will know as our consultant paramedic, and he also holds the portfolio as trust maternity lead. Most of you will be more than familiar with the wonderful Nicola Bramall, who's the Director of Quality Improvement and Patient Safety. And we're hoping that we're going to have one of the consultants from NUH on the line, Lucy.
I'm here.
Thank you. Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Just to note, we'd like to say a special thank you to the patient for allowing us to use her story and her baby's story to be able to support and facilitate the learning, and also to the staff who kindly agreed for the case to be shared as well. This session will be recorded. We will stop recording once we open up for discussion and questions at the end. If we can just all maintain sort of good Teams etiquette of mics off and muted if you're not speaking. We will be monitoring the chat function, so we will try and pick up any questions as and when they come up, but we will take questions at the end. And once the session is recorded, it should be uploaded onto Tara in the next couple of days for people to be able to view at their leisure. If I could have the next slide, Rita. So obviously most of you are probably familiar with how we're running these sessions now, and what we want to do is really give you as our staff in EMAS an idea of some of the events that are occurring, and we want to try and pick out some of the really good work, because we know that you are delivering outstanding care on a daily basis, but we also want to share with you when perhaps things haven't gone so well, and how we can change and adopt our practice and learn and do things differently. And this is all about a just culture. So we know that in organisations like ours, we work in a very complex, often very fragile system, and it isn't down to individuals when things necessarily go wrong. There's much wider organisational issues, and this is what we hope to sort of pick out and let you see, that we do investigate events fairly. We aren't using it as a blame tool at all for staff. It is purely how EMAS, we can learn from incidents, we can deliver the learning to you as staff, and we can improve the care that we deliver to our patients. So this case is in specific to an obstetric emergency, so a preterm labour in breech presentation with hemorrhage. And if we can move on to the next slide, I think often obstetric cases, particularly with young children and babies, are very distressing for staff. And often when events happen, whatever the nature of the event, staff can feel under pressure, upset, often go home worrying, could they have done something differently? Did their care impact on the outcome? And this is really just a slide to remind everybody that there are multiple options within EMAS that staff can be referred to, self-refer to. So there's obviously peer-to-peer chaplaincy support with RevKev. We've got PAM Assist, which is a 24/7 confidential support service. There's occupational health referrals that can be done, TRIM practitioners, the ambulance service charity, as well as access to mental health support services. So we would really encourage any staff not to go home worried about an incident. If you're worried, if you've seen something that's upset you or concerned you, please speak up before you go home. Speak to your line manager, or if needs be, I've always said that my inbox is open 24/7, that I will pick things up on a daily basis, and if needs be, I'm more than happy to talk through a case on a case-by-case basis with staff. So I'm going to hand over to Nicola now, who's kindly going to go through the timeline for this specific case.
Lovely, thank you, Rachel, and afternoon, everybody. As Rachel said, I'm Nicola Bramhall, Director of Quality Improvement and Patient Safety. What we're going to do is I'm going to go through the sequence of events of this case, and then I'm going to hand over to Sue, who was involved in the coroner's inquest that related to this case, and she'll do some observations that were identified through our investigation and the inquest process. And then I'll hand over finally to Ian to talk about some of the learning that we've had. And I just wanted to start off by saying we chose this particular case because not only is there learning from a clinical sort of management perspective of this case, but I think equally there was some learning for us as a central quality team in how we've managed incidents in the past, and things that we're looking to do to try and change that so that we can demonstrate that we are applying just culture and that we are being much more supportive of our staff. I think one of the things that it's always really easy to forget when you're going through these cases is that we now have the benefit of hindsight. The clinicians involved in this case did not know what the outcome was going to be. And I know that all of you will have been in situations in the past where, you know, things have not turned out as you thought they were going to. And for me, it's just about recognising that you all come to work to do a really good job. Nobody comes to work expecting there to be an adverse outcome. That does happen. As Rachel said, the really important thing is that we try and learn from that. I'm also really conscious that a sequence of events is very matter of fact. And for me, I think it's really important that we try and get across some of the sort of more complexities of these cases. So I'll go through the timeline with you, but for me, it's about recognising that, you know, what the clinicians faced on this day was, you know, a complex situation. The environment wasn't ideal. This was a first floor flat up a very narrow flight of steep stairs. When they arrived on scene, there wasn't an overhead light in the room that they were treating the patient in. They only had sort of like a bedside lamp. It was quite a chaotic scene. There was a cat, I believe, that had to keep being pushed off the bed, and eventually the partner put that cat in a different room. But we had a really distressed partner and a really distressed patient. So I think we just need to remember that it's not as clear cut as it sometimes comes across in a black and white sequence of events. So just to take you back to what happened, at 10:17 in the morning, a 999 call was received from a 25-year-old in her third trimester. She was 35 weeks plus 6. She had a hemorrhage. She was in known breech presentation, and that was coded as a C2. Now, the EMD actually queried with the team leader because they expected, given that presentation, that they would have achieved a C1 disposition. So they the dispatch officer was alerted so that resource could actually be dispatched, because they couldn't work out why it hadn't achieved a C1, but they knew that wasn't quite right. So, you know, one of the things we also do when we do these investigations is highlight good practice. So that was absolutely good practice. It's probably just worth saying that about half an hour prior to this call coming to us, the partner had actually phoned the delivery suite, and the delivery suite had advised him to bring mum in. He had tried to bring mum in himself, but I think, you know, he couldn't drive, he couldn't get anybody else to support, and actually she was in so much pain that he'd have really struggled, I think, to get her down those stairs that I described. So at 10:33, we allocated a DCA. It was a double paramedic crew, and at 10:40, the DCA arrived on scene at the patient's bedside by 10:42. Paramedic 1 assessed the patient. They could see that a part of the baby was visible, but they really weren't sure what was presenting. What they did know was that it definitely wasn't the head, and it definitely wasn't a foot, but they couldn't actually identify what the presentation was. So at 10:47, paramedic 2 made repeated attempts to call the community midwife, and they were using a number that was in the handheld records. Now, they didn't get any reply, and that's because this happened on a Saturday, and this was actually Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 admin line. So 10 minutes later, at 10:57, the paramedic calls the delivery suite and speaks to a midwife who requests a photograph, and the same was sent with the patient's consent. The midwife advises that it's the baby's head and to proceed with delivery. And midwife 1 continues to provide remote advice by phone and requests a community midwife to attend. At 11:13, a second photograph is requested and is sent, as the paramedics believe that the testes have been delivered. Midwife 1 provides breech manoeuvre instructions, and the baby is actually delivered up to the umbilicus. Next slide, please, Rita. At 11:18, a consultant obstetrician becomes involved in a call, and I think what happened was they weren't called to be involved in this case. They sort of happened upon quite a chaotic scene at the telephone on the delivery suite, and kind of intervened because they could see that things were clearly not going too well. Now at 11:22, a community midwife arrives on scene. Now, those of you that have been involved in midwifery cases, I'm sure, at the point when a midwife arrives on scene, you kind of have that huge sigh of relief that somebody with the required skill set and more experience is now there to take over clinical leadership. Unfortunately, in this case, that is not what happened, and the paramedics were really left by that initial midwife to continue to manage the situation. The obstetrician continues to provide instructions to the paramedics over the phone, advise on manoeuvres so that they can release the arms and shoulders, and that is successful. At 11:27, they actually changed the telephone call to a video call, because you can imagine that communication will have been very, very difficult over the phone. There would have been a lot of noise, probably in both ends of that call. And the obstetrician advises for the patient to assume the McRoberts position and asks the community midwife to perform an episiotomy. This, however, isn't actually completed. Now, the obstetrician talks paramedic 1 through, I'm going to say MSV because I don't want to embarrass myself in front of Lucy Keane, because I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. So that manoeuvre is performed to aid flexion. And at 11:30, a second and third community midwife arrive on scene and take over that manoeuvre. And the baby is actually delivered to the nape of the neck, but then labour fails to progress. At 11:31, the decision is made to transfer mum and baby to the delivery suite, and mum is walked to the ambulance stretcher with midwife supporting the baby. 11:38, the DCA leaves scene, and at 11:54, they've arrived at the delivery suite. 12:04, baby's delivered by Neville Barnes forceps and handed to the care of the neonatologists. 2 days later, sadly, baby's care is refocused to end of life, and he dies peacefully surrounded by his parents and his family. So following the incident, the acute trust reported the case as a serious incident, and we undertook an internal high-level investigation, and we had the opportunity to review and amend that prior to the submission to the coroner for the inquest, and Sue will explain, I'm sure, why that was necessary. An inquest took place in March of this year, and that concluded that baby's death was natural causes, contributed to by neglect, and the neglect was related to the delayed delivery. So I'll hand over to Sue now, who's going to talk you through some of the observations.
Thank you, Nicola. I'm Sue Jevons. I'm currently the Coroner's Senior Quality Manager for EMAS, and I've also been helping the SI process during COVID. Before I start on the observations, I would just like to say that the patient's mum has been very complimentary of the two paramedics that attended, to the point where she is training or currently looking into training to become a CFR before she can focus herself on to becoming a paramedic, which is what she's aiming to do in the very near future. After the patient's death and up until coroner's and before COVID hit, the patient's mum was actually volunteering in the maternity units. She's a remarkable woman and at no point blames anybody. So I'll just move on to the observations. The patient had 3 obstetric complications. She was preterm, she hemorrhaged, and the baby was a breech presentation. And we knew she was a breech presentation from the scans that she'd had previously. The crew were with the patient for 5 minutes before seeking any midwifery support. It was an obstetric emergency and there was a need for a rapid transfer. This unfortunately wasn't actioned. The baby's mum repeatedly told the paramedics that she was breech. However, once we could see a part of the baby, we didn't recognise that that was a bottom. The crew initially tried to contact the midwifery support, as Nicola said. However, this number is not manned in the out of hours and it was a Saturday. There was a further 10 minutes delay before the delivery suite was contacted, and then there was some confusion whether this was a pre-alert or was to obtain advice from the hospital. At the coroner's inquest, I brought this up, that this could be alleviated if all the phones had been recorded, and that is something that the coroner looked into and asked for advice from the hospital, because That way we would know then what information was given, and that would aid the patient and the coroner's process. The use of photographs and video conference, whilst it was done with the patient's consent, was really a deviation from accepted practice, and it did breach the IG rules, which we do recognise that it was the best intention for the patient, and it wasn't something that the paramedics had asked, it was what the hospital had advised. JR Count guidelines weren't followed. In all the 3 complications present, advice to transfer immediately unless birth was imminent. The paramedics wrongly interpreted that the labour was progressing because they could see a small part of the body. However, labour was not progressing enough. Next slide, Rita, please. Professionals repeatedly failed to listen to the patient, and that is one of the things that the patient's mum wanted to get across. She really wanted us for future to listen to the patient, to listen to what they're saying. The first midwife, when arrived on scene, did not assume any clinical lead. She was quite shocked. I think she wasn't expecting to see what she saw. However, she should have taken the clinical lead on this case. There were difficult conversations and communication between the professionals, leading to confusing picture and inappropriate advice. So the hospital were telling our paramedics to put their hands in certain positions on mum. However, the community midwife was on scene, was moving the paramedics' hands to a completely different position. The time from home to the delivery suite was initially 16 minutes. An earlier transfer, according to the hospital, would have resulted in a different outcome. Our total on-scene time was 56 minutes. This was a devastating outcome for both mum and baby. This impacted on all the staff involved, support pre, during the inquest and beyond. We do a lot more pre-inquest meetings now. We support the staff from the first initial getting all the information. We need to support them to help them through the whole process, and at the inquest we always have managers there. Issues were identified with our EMAS investigation process. We received the serious incident from the hospital and it didn't quite match up, or we weren't aware of some of what was in their SI process, and it initially blamed EMAS's delayed on scene time for the outcome of the baby. So the quality team got together and we redid some of the SI and got a lot more information and submitted this to the coroner. The acute trust and the ambulance investigations at that time were not aligned. We now align a lot of the investigations. If another trust is doing an SI, then we will be part of that SI if they request, and we often ask other trusts to contribute to our SIs. And I think I'm handing over now to Ian.
Hi, Sue, thank you. Sorry, missed my mute button. Yeah, I think for me, probably where I'd like to keep my little bit is probably in the same way we need to deal with our patients. It's about keeping it simple and seeking support, and that's why we've got Lucy as a guest expert for us today, so I can suddenly panic and go, Lucy, quickly take over. Certainly one of the big things that comes out, and it's out there in the literature, about mum's experiences of ambulance services. There's a great study in Australia that kind of shows some of the issues of the differences in how people manage and listen to mums. They know their condition, they know their body. It's a real positive to make sure we listen. Even if you're listening and your communication is just calming them down and making them feel more a part of that process. There's that risk that we fall into medicalising it to the point where we're blunt, we're abrupt. And this is somebody who's going through either a tragedy with their unborn child or actually bringing their child into the world. It's about keeping those people skills in there. We really need to pay attention to our on-scene time, and it's come up a number of times over the years. I'd have to declare I was involved in an SI related to a breech delivery several years ago in the trust. which again had unfortunately the same outcome. We were involved sort of very late on in the case, but actually the on-scene time was protracted. For maternity emergencies, the best place for somebody to be is in an obstetric unit, typically with people who understand their subject, have access to the equipment, the facilities, the resources and the knowledge to make the decision. And we need to move away from that fear of, I can't move somebody during labour. It's okay to move somebody during labour. Consider your risks and manage them as you go along. So do you need to make sure that there's no risk of a child being delivered as you move down the stairs, sort of providing support? But remember, there's people delivering babies in paddling pools, on space hoppers, swinging from seats. It's not the scary thing we think it needs to be. It needs to be calm and considered, and you'll undoubtedly hear that sort of when Lucy comes on. It's not a scream and panic and run around. It's calmly think about your options and make the best choice. Typically that best choice is going to be in an obstetric unit. Around our communication, use the tools that are out there. So in the app we've got the SBAR tool, and we've actually got a developed SBAR tool for maternity and obstetrics in there for you. Again, it gives that commonality of language and makes sure we're covering all the elements that we need to. And the next slide's actually got some of the detail on there for you, just so you can see it. It's in the app, and the slide is a slightly condensed version to fit it onto a page. One thing we've noticed over the years is we've developed our education offer. So we've been delivering programmes in Derbyshire called Prompt 3, which is an emergency obstetric programme with a community sort of focus. Also, our AAPs have been undertaking a lot more focused education around obstetric emergencies and getting into that skills drills mentality. And the plan is we will start to develop that and offer it out further, because clearly we have a number of staff who will deal with these cases, albeit very rarely. And that is one of our challenges. The rarity of us experiencing these sort of cases is quite difficult. So we do need to make sure that we have that ability to recognise our limitations and recognise when we need to move on. If we go to the next slide, we just look at the SBAR. So Lucy, if you've got things, feel free to shout as we go through. So this is just the SBAR tool. So this was something we took to the maternity network probably several years ago now, and I think it's grown a little bit since. It's just about us having that shared language and making sure we could get a coherent message across. And certainly one of our big bits of learning is make sure you're clear what you're asking. Are you asking for advice? And I think typically that advice will be, can you move them? And if you can, let's make that the priority. If not, it would be guidance around certain manoeuvres to do if you're in a position where you cannot deliver that baby or care for them without that expert support. In terms of video conferencing and things like that, certainly I think we recognise that in this case, the clinicians made a judgment to do that, and I think that was done in a positive approach and was potentially quite beneficial, and it's something we are sort of working towards as an organisation, that increase our sort of telemedicine capability. Lucy, is there anything from some sort of key messages from you, I think?
I think just to remember that you've often got a lot more time than you think you have, even when you can see the presenting part. The rundown didn't say whether this was this lady's first baby or not, but if you're dealing with a lady having a first baby, even when you can see the presenting part, you've always got a bit more time than you think. I would say I wouldn't be critical of anybody for not being able to deliver a difficult breech. You know, sometimes they are just really difficult, really difficult. And the preterm ones are more difficult than the term ones, because the head is more likely to be harder to deliver, because they tend to be a bit skinnier and the body comes through more easily. So we know that preterm breeches can be really difficult. So from the perspective of the crew, you know, they were in a really difficult situation. I completely agree that in the SBAR tool, the teams need to be absolutely focused on what they are asking of the staff at the other end, because the staff at the other end won't be in the position of the ambulance crew. They're more experienced, they deal with this stuff all the time, and they're not having to deal with this. So for the ambulance crew to say, and I say this to mothers as well when they phone in, when you phone in, be really clear what it is you want to get out of this. So, you know, if you phone and say, we've got this lady, we can see the presenting part, but we're really worried, we're only 14 minutes away, we think the right thing to do is to bring her in. You know, they do need to be that directive, I think.
Thanks. So apologies, I think I disappeared in the middle of that one, so I've just had to swap my phone from my laptop as the internet's dropped off.
So yeah, I was just saying, you know, be really directive when you're the crew. Say, you know, you're the people on the ground. Say what you want to get from the maternity team. And of course, you know, the distance you've got to travel will inform that. But in some ways, you know, it might not have been any more difficult if that baby really started to come to do things in the back of the ambulance than it was to do things in a cramped bedroom with a partner and a cat. So, you know, what's the worst that can happen? You might deliver the baby en route, but is that going to be a lot worse than delivering the baby in the home?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's an inbuilt fear we've all developed over years in the ambulance service that we probably just need to break that myth that actually it's okay to move.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've all probably had that drummed into us over the years of you must stay and deliver, but actually it is that.
I think in almost all circumstances I would scoop and run, you know. There are very few times when I'd attempt a difficult delivery in the home if I thought I could get the woman safely to the ambulance. Okay, you know, delivering the baby in the stairwell might not have been ideal, but if you thought you could get to the ambulance, I'd have probably, you know, almost always advise to go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I delivered my daughter on the bathroom floor, so that wasn't ideal, but
no.
Back of an ambulance is probably no worse, and certainly probably no less hygienic than the state of our bathroom at the time because it was being refitted. So.
And you know, a cramped bedroom with a soft bed and no lighting, you know, is not ideal anyway. At least in the back of the ambulance, you've got a bit of decent lighting.
Absolutely. So, thanks, Lucy. So I'm on my phone, I'm afraid, now because the internet from my laptop has disappeared. Do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks, Rita.
So I think the next slide is actually for any questions. And Lucy, I've already got a question for you from some of the people watching, is if you could explain the Loveset procedure and MSV.
Okay, so